For this panel, we have Thomas Naunheim, cybersecurity architect for glueckkanja AG, Eric Woodruff, senior security researcher at Semperis, Gil Kirkpatrick, chief architect at Semperis, and Guido Grillenmeier, my partner in crime, principal technologist EMEA for Semperis. Thanks, gentlemen. Thanks for coming in. So the first question is the most obvious question, and I think everybody is happy for it. So what exactly is a workload identity? Let's start with 101.
Yeah, so it's an overriding notion for giving an application or workload. Could be an automation account, could be any resource in Azure, also any automation script or something like that, an identity. And Microsoft has also used workload identity or workload ID as a product name, because there are more and more features around managing those non-human identities, and therefore they summarize that as a product name called Workload ID Premium. And I would, from my point of view, split a little bit the definition. So we have application identities, which could be an OAuth application with delegated permissions for authentication. Or, for example, having more workload identity. Maybe some of you already heard about managed identities, and that's particular for a non-interactively sign-in, so they are more running as a background job or something like that. So I would split between application and workload identities.
Let me add a little bit of a further background to that, because Thomas rightly went right into the details of how it is in Entra. I think the challenge with workloads as such, that they need an identity, it's of course nothing new. It's not a cloud thing only. Yeah. So anybody running in their on-prem environment has had that same thing. I like to call them technical identities. Basically, what you want, like we just had non-human, like non-normal user identities, yeah. But the majority of organizations are actually not using them in their on-prem environment sufficiently. It wasn't there in the early days of Microsoft identity platforms. Neither NT4 had them. Active Directory didn't have them for many years. And so it was just your classic service account. A service account was used for an application, for a server, to get access to resources that it requires to do its job, actually for the application to run, to access either the identity system itself or resources, databases, instead of having someone to log on to do that for them. And that's always been a challenge. Yeah. So how does a system where not a user logs on, but the application itself is running, how does it get access to something in a secure way? And so in the early days, it was, domain joined systems were able to then run in the security context of a machine, and then, maybe even use just a computer account. Or if you want to be more specific and grant specific permissions, you had a service account. And of course, everybody should be using, first it was the normal managed service account. When did that come? I think it was 2008 or 2. Nobody really used that because it was sort of dedicated to a single machine only. And then the group managed service accounts came, right? Which is sort of that managed identity that we now are looking forward into the cloud as well. But the problem has always been there. How do I give a workload an identity that it can get to resources? If it doesn't need that, doesn't necessarily need an identity, right? But if you need it to attach to something, to get resources, even to read the identity store, then you need some way to assign that to a machine. And that's exactly what this talk is about.
I was just going to say that I'm usually doing that rambles, and I feel like Guido and I must have switched places because, yeah, I think they're a service account right at the core of things. So
is there an analogy between workload identities and, say, computer accounts that people are familiar with? Is there some connection? Can you look at computer accounts as a different flavor of, say, a workload identity?
I mean, I would say it's the consulting answer is it depends on what the workload is. And right, I mean, I think if we're thinking of the cloud and you start talking about things like managed identities, which may be assigned to a, device, it could be a virtual machine, right? I guess I'd say sometimes it feels like it's splitting hairs, but thinking, more traditional senses of, right, like a service account and AD versus a computer account in Active Directory, right, where they're different things. There's still differentiations out in Entra. I don't know that's like a non-answer answer, but I don't know if you have.
Yeah, so when we take a look on Intune managed devices, we have also kind of device identity. So there's a certificate involved and so on. So I would expect when we're talking about workload identities, of course, if you take a look in Microsoft documentation, there's also, they point out this is part also device identities, but I would say if we're talking about service principals, managed identities, and so on, it's more about workloads and not devices.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess I'll just point out in AD, right, you could give, permissions to a computer to have access to resources where in the cloud you can't. Like if I have a VM that I want to have access to something, like I have to go have a workload identity. There's no device identity I can like grant, ACLs to or whatnot, so.
So this helps differentiate the idea of a machine identity from a regular user account, because those of us that come from on-premises, for all intents and purposes, they're the same thing. You just use them for different. But now we have gotten to more diversified and more specialized accounts, and that's what we're talking about today. So what is the life cycle of workload identities in Entra?
Depends.
Well, I mean, I'd say, unfortunately, that's a big question in that history is repeating itself. The way that many organizations don't have a strong life cycle around service accounts in AD, see the same patterns out in the cloud with workload identities. Where they're just created. There is no sort of, termination time for the account. There's no monitoring of its usage. And honestly, right, even some of the problems that we'd see in Active Directory where we weren't using a GMSA or a managed service account, we're just using a user as a service account. I mean, you still see those patterns out in the cloud where people aren't using a service principal. They're just creating a user out there. So...
Let me ask the audience, how many of you are concerned or dealing with the proliferation of these workload identities without governance, and they're out there and you're not sure what's happening? And yeah, okay, well, good. That's
almost all hands.
So is it true that the workload identities are managed completely separately from the workload themselves? They're completely distinct entities?
Once again, it depends. So there are two types of workload identities, I would say. So we have the service principal and app registration. Most of you already have faced that in the Azure portal or in the Entra portal. And there's no integrated lifecycle process. You have to take care on your own when to create and offboard this application. But on the other side, we have managed identities in Azure. And there are two types of managed identities. System assigned, which already gives an indication that these are bounded to your system. In this case, the system is the Azure resource. But with the capabilities of Azure Arc, we have the option to give a resource also on-prem or in a third-party cloud environment, managed identity as well, because Azure knows about the resource because of the Azure Arc connection. And as soon Azure as management plane has the visibility of resources, they can give a resource identity. And this is the system assigned managed identity that I am talking about. But on the other side, yeah.
You're going to talk about the life cycle of that identity in comparison to the life cycle of that system, right?
Yeah. So the system assigned managed identity is bounded to the resource. So as soon as the resource will be deleted, also the system assigned managed identity will be automatically deleted.
Exactly.
But on the other side, we have something called user assigned managed identity. And what a surprise, this is a managed identity that has to be managed by a user. So there is no automatically life cycle depending on the assigned resource. So that's the reason why it depends when we're talking about
it.
And why would you have that?
Good question, but in the end of the day, you have maybe 2-3 virtual machines in Azure, and they should have access to another resource, and they should have exactly the same identity or permissions. So then you have the relation that one identity can be used by more than one resource. So if you are using a system-assigned managed identity, there's always a one-by-one relation, and that could be an interesting use case if you like to share access across various resources.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, yeah, it's very much like group managed service account, but it's workloads like, right, like to my mind goes like Kubernetes and things like that, where, right, you have clustered systems that you're sort of sharing that identity across, where user assigned would make sense, but.
Let me just add that quite a few people aren't aware that even in the on-prem world with AD, like we just said, those system assigned ones would be like the normal managed service account versus the group managed service account that you can use in multiple environments, but they all are at least normally assigned to the machine. The machine gets the permission to read the password and then use that group managed service account. But with 2019, Microsoft added the capability to actually assign it to a workload, to a container. Yeah? Not a classic application workload like we're talking about in Entra, but to a container to get rid of that dependency to the machine. Very much like I see the managed identity and the workload identity that we're talking about here. That's how I compare them.
And one important thing to consider in the differences between managing an application, as I said, as an app registration object in Microsoft Entra, and the whole managed identity stuff is we have different RBAC systems. So it depends on your Entra ID role if you are authorized to create an application object. But when we are talking about managed identity, it's a question of your role in the Azure RBAC. So even you own a subscription in Azure, you are authorized to create managed identities. And that is something that you should consider if you like to have a central team that is responsible for monitoring and the whole process about your identities in your environment.
Hasn't Microsoft introduced new capabilities for managing these or protecting them? There's identity protection for managed identities. What is new out there that folks should be aware of that may make their job easier?
Oh, there has been a couple of things, right? So, but let's have a quick important side note. Features that we have for protecting workload identities have different support capabilities. So for example, there's something called conditional access and also an Entra ID protection for workload identities, but they are just working for single tenant application and they are not supported for managed identities. So there are some small side notes that you should consider, but nevertheless, I would really strongly recommend to have a look on that, and there are also nice features. And
yeah, I mean, I think with what you're talking about, going back to the different, RBAC models and different places that you assign these things, like, right, with managed identities, you do benefit from the fact that it has to be tied to some sort of resource, right, where conditional access is more like, right, thinking traditional, you have a service principal, and, I'm sharing out the secret for it, and, right, that gets leaked, or it's out in GitHub or something, right, and someone can come across that and then go authenticate to whatever, endpoint is that the app is supposed to have access to, right? So that's where like conditional access comes in, right? Because you could say only allow access from, these trusted corporate networks. You're not going to have those same sort of issues like with a Azure VM, right? Because you can't sort of like go take it out of Azure and put it somewhere else. But yeah, it definitely makes it more difficult because architecturally and even trying to like visualize or understand what it looks like it's a very big sort of map.
Is there, one of the aspects of this is how do you permission these things? And permissions are, we thought Active Directory permissions were complicated. What are some best practices and what are some of the things that you see when organizations provision these new accounts? Are there ways to make the provisioning process, the permissions process, more granular? Are there tools to assist that, or are you throwing a dart against a dartboard and hoping and potentially over permissioning to get the job done?
So I think all of us knows back in the days of Active Directory when the first application vendor asked, hey, I need domain admins permission to run for having
I need a schema update.
Yeah, of course. We have the same situation with some applications in Microsoft Entra. So of course, we should, especially when it comes to Microsoft Graph API permission, we should always consider to use least privilege on this point. And there's a couple of tools out there also from Microsoft, like Microsoft Defender for Cloud Apps App Governance, so really short product name. It's included also in the E5 license, and that allows you to analyze unused API permissions. So, of course, first of all, only assign least privilege, but afterwards, checking with MDA app governance if, for example, M365 API permissions will be used. And you can also see a diagram of uploaded and downloaded volume data to see any suspicious data traffic from our application. And in my opinion, really interesting to monitor. And the other one is Microsoft invested over the last 12 months to bring Entra ID recommendations for customers. And that includes to analyze if credentials, an application, or secrets are unused. Unfortunately, this feature is limited to customers that own Workload ID premium licenses. That is what I mentioned before. But nevertheless, this is, in my opinion, a really powerful way to see after giving permissions if the application is really in use of that one, or maybe we are over-privileged in this case.
I was just going to add on or hit on a point that Thomas mentioned. Right, again, we're also looking at different authorization models here because, right, if the workload identity is supposed to be doing something in Azure, right, that's Azure RBAC, and there is actually a lot of granularity, out there where it almost feels like too much, which is great. But yeah, in Graph, it's definitely, there are times that you'll find, right, you're in a scenario where maybe you can't be as granular as you want. Right, and then it starts to get into the whole conversation about, risk tolerance and acceptance and all that good stuff.
I think it's fair enough to point out that that granularity is a challenge. We're talking about, what was the last number that I heard? 7,200 role permissions, not roles, role permissions, graph permissions, and whatever you could set to grant permissions for an application, and to tune that down to least privilege is difficult. Because also, let's say those built-in roles that you might want to use, they're often over-permissioned for the tasks that you want a workload to perform, or that even you want users to perform. Yeah, and then additional challenge that I think companies must just understand to handle is with those two different types of workload identities that we talked about, the machine-specific, system-specific, always forget the name, and then the user one. Well, the system one doesn't exist until the resource is there. Yeah, so it's difficult to pre-permission. Yeah, you basically have to permission on the fly. Yeah, and that's also a reason why that user-centric one allows you to prep better and test, reduce the permissions, even if you should just use it for one. But of course, without governance of those identities, that still doesn't help. But it does help to not over-permission just to get things working quickly.
But there's one trick what we can use to find a workaround to avoid really high privilege Graph API permissions. For example, you have an application, and sometimes an application asks to get permission to read-write all operations on all groups. That is something what I like to avoid. I think there's no reason why a simple business application should have this access on all groups.
And
what we can do is we can replace the Graph API permission by an Entra ID directory role. And Entra ID directory role can be scoped on specific groups by assigning them to administrative units, similar to what we have with organizational units in Active Directory. And we can build custom roles. Right. And that allows us to really focusing on they can update membership on this group of groups. And that is more efficient and more least privileged than giving groups read-write all permissions to an application.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
And
go ahead,
that of
Gil.
course requires that you know exactly what the application's trying to do.
That would be good if the developer can tell us. And
Yeah. So what ways are these workload identities abused? And how do you protect against such things? It's one of the things we're hearing overriding is the need for governance. But what are some practical steps that our audience can take to get their arms around and do some risk mitigation for workload identities?
There's a lot in that question. I mean, I do think, though, the numbers that Alex showed yesterday about workload or machine identities, right, show how these things are being abused. And I think it's a space where, right, the attackers are going to figure it out before the defenders do if we don't sort of get our arms around it. I think it's so tough because it depends on your maturity model as far as like kind of giving like that answer. Again, seeing orgs that will still just not even use service principals, that they'll just use user accounts, right? So for them, it's like, well, let's start investigating service principals. And many times the feeling is almost like, right, that they're scared. There's the whole FUD thing going on, right? They're not sure how they work. They feel scary. So it's kind of like, we'll just put them aside. No, I think you see right on GitHub, there's, this constant problem of secrets, credentials sort of being left out in repos, right, because of developers having bad practices, and right, they're scanning out there sort of proactively to fix those things. But for securing your workload identities, again, I'd say the overly permissive bit, and right, again, analyzing the utilization of these service principals. They're seeing if they're even used, right? Because again, I'd say another thing that people are scared about, right? We'd have this problem in Active Directory where you don't know if a service account is still being used until you get rid of it, and then someone complains and you're, trying to bring it back to life. Some orgs either use tooling that's out there to try to determine if the service principal is used, or it's not that hard to go shut it off, right? I mean, that's kind of become a more common thing that's acceptable sometimes, right?
The screen test?
Disable, right? Yeah, exactly.
Let me add that I think the tips are pretty similar to what Nestori Sunima just shared on the token theft topic. Some stuff you can only find out by proper logging and log analytics, by understanding that, first of all, you need to know where those accounts are used. Simpler if it's a system assigned one than the user one that can be used on multiple systems. But once you know where to expect the log on from, well, then you can find in the logs when it's one that's logged on from a different system that you don't expect it from, different IP, whatever it is, So I think that logic and that capability needs to be built out, and ideally, of course, built into, I don't know if it's Entra sign-in logic analysis that needs to grow up a bit there to just also warn about misuse. But that's what I would concentrate on to figure out, just like we would an on-prem, like there's an account used where you don't expect it to, And
I think it goes beyond that too, is you also want to track what resources it's accessing and how it's accessing it. Because not only do you want to know if that identity's being authenticated against, but you want to know what permissions it's actually using.
Yeah, and also to give some additional point to this question. So we have to talk about the entry point for attacker. So what would be the way to compromise a workload identity? Most people considering, hey, of course, the resource that is using the identity, like the server, like the Azure resource that is assigned to the managed identity. But what I can see out there, we have also a big issue regarding delegation, who owns the managed identity or the service principal, because, as I said, you have delegation concepts behind that. So, for example, if you allow everyone in your tenant to create a service principal, which is by default enabled, so everyone in the tenant can create a service principal. In the past, it has become automatically the creator an owner. An owner means permanent full access on the object, which means this person has the authorization to create credentials. And sometimes they are not admins, so they are using regular work accounts. They are very easily to be part of a phishing campaign or something like that. And in this case, the attacker have an access token to talk to Microsoft Graph to have a level of movement to the service principal. So we should have a particular look on who owns a workload identity, and take care that we have not regular work accounts with privileges to create or manage workload identities.
But that's also a first step towards governance, is that you have a name, you have a throat to choke when you're going to try to find out about that.
Yeah.
And these identities don't have a soft delete function either, correct?
They have for application, I guess.
The application.
They
just
for
added
service
applications.
principal, I would expect they have
Right.
also some support there as well. now.
So there's some assistance in the scream test. That they can be brought back again. So that's great. Do gentlemen have any closing thoughts? Any suggestions to help folks out in this?
I mean, I'll just say, I think a lot of times I've seen orgs have like that analysis paralysis thing where, right, it feels too daunting. And so they're, again, kind of like, well, I'm just going to not do anything about it because I don't even know where to start. And I think it's very much almost like drawing that line in the sand, right, where you need to sort of get your arms around what you currently have. And then in parallel, if we're going to start governance, right, like do that at the same time, but don't try to combine it all together, right, where you've got one bucket of problems and trying to figure out what's what with the stuff that already exists. And then it's going to take some work, right, to build out governance around this. And in that, it's so much of like a it depends consulting answer, depending on what you do and what you're using. But yeah, it's needing to take time to really understand that stuff, right? And I think we see these, sort of crazy advanced attacks, right? Like the Midnight Blizzard thing against Microsoft, right? I know it's very cliche, but right, if it happens to them, it could happen to anyone. Yeah, it's the governance piece.
And I would say start using workload identities on a very sort of a trial basis, add that capability incrementally, and build tools as you go along to do sort of the auditing and reporting and understand how they're behaving in the real world. And that'll help you iterate as you want to deploy more and more application identities.
Yeah,
Would you say a first step is to remove the ability for anybody to create workload identities, which is the default permission? Is that correct?
That's the subscription owner that has that permission, not necessarily everybody. But as a general tip, it's a general tip for anything you do. The KISS principle, keep it simple, right? Don't overcomplicate the planning around workload identities for, even the permission model. Have a structure in place, and specifically, I think that's definitely a good tip there. Look as to who can create those identities and monitor that only the right group that's supposed to manage them is creating them. So if someone else is creating identities, that you get a warning and then, sort of handle it in your procedures because you can't take away that permission, unfortunately. Yeah.
Well, great, gentlemen. Thank you very much. Thanks for the conversation, and hopefully we have some good tips to help these guys out. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean.
Thank you.